It's been 3 years since the Taliban overthrew Afghanistan's government and took over the country.
The United States ended 20 years of war in Afghanistan, the longest war in American history.
16,000 people. It's the biggest humanitarian airlift in the history of this country.
The military mission is over. A new diplomatic mission has begun.
For people living there, rights and freedoms have been stripped, the economy is in turmoil, and basic services are limited. For millions who fled, they are now scattered across the world, and the future remains uncertain. First, let's rewind. Who are the Taliban, and how did they gain control of Afghanistan?
The history is complex, but the current conflict kicked off in the Cold War. In the 1970s, the Soviets invaded and installed a communist regime. This was not supported by the West, who backed and armed the rebel Mujahideen. The country fell into conflict, the Soviets and the government on one side, and the Mujahideen on the other. Half the population was displaced by the 1980s. Almost a decade later, the Soviets eventually left Afghanistan. The Mujahideen then took power, but rival factions began fighting, and a civil war ensued. This is when the Taliban emerged. The group managed to take power in 1996. But in 2001, the Taliban was toppled from power, as the US and others invaded Afghanistan in the wake of the 9/11 terror attacks. These were carried out by Al-Qaeda, who were hosted by the Taliban. Western forces felt it necessary to drive out Al-Qaeda and topple the Taliban to prevent any future attacks. This started the West's war in Afghanistan, which became the United States' longest ever military engagement, with the fighting continuing for 20 years. To bring an end to the conflict in 2020, the US made a deal to withdraw troops on the condition that the Taliban commit to national peace talks and respect women's rights, which ultimately they didn't see through. The US and UK made final evacuations by the end of August, as the Taliban violently reclaimed the country and overthrew the government.
The previous administration's agreement said that if we stuck to the May 1st deadline that they had signed on to leave by, the Taliban wouldn't attack any American forces. But if we stayed, all bets were off. That was the choice, the real choice, between leaving or escalating.
The UK ambassador for Afghanistan was on one of the final planes to leave Kabul airport. He told The Standard what the situation was like on the ground.
Personally, I don't think that the Taliban fighting their way back to power came as a surprise. I mean, the writing was pretty much on the wall. But nobody, I think the Taliban included, anticipated the extreme rapidity of the collapse towards the end. And of course, what that meant was that a lot of Afghans were not ready to get out of the country. That's why there were so many people turning up, descending on the airport, just trying to get out. And of course, we were still bringing in the forces that we would need to hold the airport and conduct an evacuation when the government fell and the Taliban were back in charge. Of course, what happened next was that very, very large numbers of Afghans descended on the airport, trying to get out by any means whatsoever. And of course, by that stage, there weren't enough military actually to hold the airport, and we lost control of the runways.
For the first time in decades, the country is no longer in war, but peace under the Taliban is not easy. Elections have been scrapped and demonstrations have been clamped down on. The UN says that the Taliban has reduced corruption and banned opium production, which has fallen drastically. But experts say their promise on a softer rule has proved hollow. Much like their last stint in power, the Taliban have been deeply restrictive when it comes to the rights for women and girls. They now have to cover their faces in public, they cannot visit parks or restaurants, and can't travel without a male chaperone. Most women aren't allowed to work, and girls over 12 are mostly barred from education. The UN have condemned their system, calling it gender apartheid. Khurshid Nazari is 17 years old and she's living in London after fleeing Afghanistan. She says she fears for her family's safety back at home.
Imagine not being able to go to school, having no education, living at home, knowing that in the future you're just going to be a housewife. That's very difficult for them. And hearing stories from my cousins and how they are having a difficult time with that, with the Taliban, and how they can't even go outside with no freedom. They can't do anything they want. They don't have any voice. It's very hard. I feel for them deeply, and I feel like they deserve much more than they have right now. One of my cousins nearly committed suicide because she was last year of school and she was like in year 12. She was going to finish school, but then it's just the Taliban took over, and it was a very sad information for me when she told me that she cannot handle that. She cannot handle not graduating when she was this close to graduate.
So the situation in Afghanistan is pretty grave. But what's it like for those who have fled? As of March this year, around 21,000 people have formally settled here under the Afghan resettlement program. But it's not been without its criticism, with many still waiting for homes and refuge. Charities say that a shortage of temporary accommodation has left some living in hostels for more than 2 years or facing homelessness, with services stretched too thin.
We, as an organization, become very, very busy. We become the focal point for thousands of refugees to get some advice and guidance how they can help their families back home in Afghanistan, as well as those evacuated by the British government and started living in the bridging hotels. Even before the 15th of August, the British government evacuated thousands of people from Afghanistan. But the biggest challenge that I remember and I'm still experiencing as a community leader is the integration of these people into the society in the longer term.
At the time of the Taliban takeover, British forces evacuated 15,000 people over 2 weeks. The operation was hailed as a great success given the difficult situation. But many Afghans, some of those who risked their lives working with the British Army, were left behind.
So the people of Afghanistan, they feel some kind of betrayal from the US and its alliance. They didn't help those who've been working with them, shoulder to shoulder, fighting against Al-Qaeda, fighting against ISIS and the Taliban. But then now, after 3 years, they stuck inside the country. They are still in Afghanistan, some of them in Pakistan, and some of them in Iran. That's why I hope that the British foreign policy will be reviewed towards the Afghanistan future, and then the diaspora community will have a chance to express their views and have a voice.
Clearly, it's right that we try to get out those who, who worked most closely with us and to whom we owe that debt. It's also right that we should make sure that their resettlement in the UK is successful. But there's another point here, which is, what do we do now? And this is a country that is deeply dysfunctional, its population under enormous humanitarian pressures. I would say that it's very much in our interests to try to find ways to address those humanitarian pressures, because a state that is failed to the extent that Afghanistan now has creates pressure. It creates pressure in terms of migration, people who want to leave. It's a breeding ground for extremism and other things. That's still a problem for us, and I don't think we should ignore that.
For now, the international community remains divided on how to deal with the Taliban, on whether to engage with them at all. Some talks have taken place in July this year, but not all social issues have been covered. But while negotiations with Afghanistan's hardline Islamic leaders tiptoe along, the Taliban rule remains unshaken.